All right, good afternoon. I'm still in that vortex where I'm realizing this is like a three-dimensional audience, and this is new. Just so you know, this is what you would normally be looking at. That's my Zoom room, and where I've been mostly meeting with people for the last 2 years, as we all have. And so it's just great to be with people, to be with you, to see the work that's happening here in this community and the commitment of so many in philanthropy and nonprofits and in the United Way itself, who are committed to really making a difference for children and families in this region. I should also note I'm a recently termed off board member of our United Way Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and still chair the Public Policy Committee of the United Way, and have been deeply involved in our efforts, and so very big fan of United Way generally, and excited about all the work happening here. So what I'm going to start you by doing is actually the next thing, which will give us time to solve this for a moment, which is what I'd like you to do is just think for a moment, if your job was to design the worst team or committee or board possible, what are the things you'd put in place to make sure you got there? So come on, what are things that you would put in place to make sure that a team or committee or board failed? What do you got?
No technology skills.
No technology skills for the win. Early win here.
One person does all the talking.
One person does all the talking. Yeah, we see that happen.
Turf issues.
Turf issues.
Lack of passion.
Lack of passion.
No diversity, equity, or inclusion.
No diversity, equity, or inclusion at the table. Yeah.
Negative people.
Negative people. Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, men. We often hear things like, yeah.
Lack of vision.
Lack of vision. What else?
Accountability.
Lack of accountability, right.
Lack of engagement.
Lack of engagement, right. Like we all, yeah. Too large a size. We know, and we often hear things like big egos and competing egos and self-interest and lack of agendas and lack of clear goals. We know all of the stuff that doesn't work, but we tend to repeat. How many of you have been in a board, committee, or team that has had any of those things? Right? And so a simple way to think about how about collective impact is it's been an attempt to try and solve for that. What can we do to prevent those things from happening? How do you build coalitions, groups, teams that prevent that? And so we've built a practice around how to make that happen. But to start, and thanks. So as was mentioned, I was part of something called the White House Council on Community Solutions, and we were charged with finding how are communities solving problems. And a lot of people came to us and said, let's find those evidence-based programs, those best practice programs, and scale them across the country. And that makes a lot of sense, and made a certain amount of sense. But something was gnawing at me about that. Something was really not connecting with me about like why we had all these great programs that we're seeing. If you go, and that was, I woke up in April of 2010, and the headline of my local, Dominique and I are from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, the headline of our local newspaper was we had the worst fourth grade reading scores for black children in the country. And that afternoon, I got a newsletter from the largest youth organization in my city boasting about all the outcomes it was achieving with the 15,000 children they serve. And that disconnect really hit me. And I thought about all the programs we had in our community that I knew well that were great, that were doing amazing things, achieving outcomes. You could visit them, you could see them. And I'm like, why do we have so many great programs achieving outcomes, yet when you add it all up, this is what we get? And so I went back to our council and said, can we stop looking at those individual programs and ask a different question? Where in the country are there cities where reading scores are up 20 points? Or graduation rates are up 20 points, or teen pregnancy has been cut in half. But let's look at cities where they've actually moved the needle. And as we began that exploration, this article came out in the Stanford Social Innovation Review called Collective Impact. And they weren't inventing something, they were describing something again that already had grown in communities that had asked the same questions. why do we have this mic's? Joan, we got bad tech. We got mics that cut in and out. We've got slides that cut in, and we have clickers that aren't working. This is what happens when you've been on Zoom for 2 years, right? You get in a room, and like all the technology is like waking up. It's like, what are we doing here? How does this work? So they were describing something they had found in a few cities. They asked the same question. Why do we have so many great programs, but we're not seeing the needle move? And they found a bunch of practices that communities were doing to build these coalitions around moving population level change, around moving these population needles. And they found, and our White House Council looked at 22 cities that had moved population change by 10 points or more. And we found the same things they did. And what those were first that they had, if you click Kelsey, they had a common agenda, that they had built a result-based strategy that was at the scale and sophistication needed to address the issue. So if we're trying to move 3,000 more kids to grade level reading, we can't have a program for 20 kids here and 15 there. What would it really take? And what's the coalition we have to build? And who are all the people we need at the table to move at that level of scale? And what are the evidence-based programs and other things we can bring in to get to that goal? But we have to build an agenda that everyone agrees on and that lays out the work that everyone's going to do. But once we have that, we have to share measurement. We have to have data. We have to look at how we're doing and measure in real time, not to write a glossy report, but to manage the way most of you would. And so as people look at what they're doing, it's that ability to be able to say, like, which schools are reading scores going up in, which schools are reading scores not going up in. Where are we seeing differences among populations and things? Which programs are working? And being able on a regular basis to assess that and manage that and make changes. Then we have to align people. We have to have organizations aligned and working to move the same outcomes together. And so we can't have programs that are working in one place, and I think maybe I just have to stay, I'm going to be a statue. But we have to have programs that can work together and be implementing programs across schools and programs and others. And ideally a situation where a kid, their after-school program is doing things that their school has connected with them so that it's all connected together. And people are aligned and kids are having a single experience or other programs and groups. But that it's not all isolated programs and institutions that people are dealing with, but really working with them as a network. And then to do all that, we have to be continually coordinating and planning and managing together. There's got to be a process of continuous engagement. And managing all of that is this idea of a backbone organization, a role United Ways have often played. And other groups have played as well, but United Ways especially have been good functions in holding the backbone role of holding that all together, coordinating and facilitating the action across organizations, and getting people to work together and getting the resources needed to be able to move the needle. But to do this, we've also found that there's 3 key lessons that we've learned about what works. The first is that clear strategy drives clear commitment. And what that means is that what we can't say is that we're going to, as a community, we want to increase grade level reading, and we're not sure how much, and we don't know how many kids. But again, if we're clear that to get to our goal, if we want to increase from 60 to 80% our grade level reading, and that means moving 2,000 more kids a year, and predominantly they're in 18 schools where we have the lowest reading scores, and then we know we have a clarity of focus to drive impact and drive partners to move that result. Whereas when we often create vague or aspirational or universal results, we often don't get that level of clarity. But then every partner knows what the job is. It's to move these children in these schools to that result. Or in a case where we were working on infant mortality, we knew in the 7 zip codes with the highest amount, there were 17,000 women of childbearing age and 1,500 live births a year. And that meant we had to build programs and projects at the scale of doing that, but we had to recognize we knew our numbers. and we knew what we were managing against. And so often what we hear instead is people create universal goals. We want all children to have healthy birth outcomes, which is a great goal, but it doesn't tell me where I'm supposed to focus my work. And I don't know how many, and anything I do will count, that supports that will count, versus we're trying to reduce the disparity among 1,500 live births a year, and we want to make sure that we have 150 fewer early deliveries, and what is it going to take to move that in a community with 17,000 women of childbearing age? That drives a different conversation than a conversation about let's improve outcomes for everybody. The second thing is that form follows function, that the way we organize our coalitions and our communities around these issues will differ by what the strategy is. And this is the important thing, that who's needed at the table is driven by the strategy, not the strategy driven by who's at the table. The way nonprofits often come together is they come together and build a strategy together, and it's really about protecting their turfs. And it's about making sure that the programs they already do can be part of the new thing because there's funding coming from the United Way or whoever else. And what this is about is let's figure out really what needs to happen to move this needle, and then who are the partners we're going to need to be able to do that. One of my favorite stories I tell about this was a lot of people don't know in America right now that the highest demographic group for suicides in America right now are farmers. And in fact, the farmer suicide rate is double the veteran suicide rate in America. And in southwestern Wisconsin, which has had massive farm closures over the last 20 years, that they were working on trying to address this issue and mental health among farmers. And when they asked the question, who do we need at the table to build relationships and identify early signs of depression or anxiety among farmers, what they often found was that the relationships that were closest to them were people like mechanics and equipment implementers and seed dealers and their bankers, is to begin working with them at the table and doing mental health first aid work with those folks. And that's why when we develop a strategy around who's needed, we have to really ask who's in relationship, who can have the most influence and impact on the population we're trying to reach. And so often we start the question with just who already does work in that area, instead of thinking more broadly of the community. When we worked on infant mortality, we realized that families, friends, and neighbors, that other women were probably the biggest producers of outcome in terms of preventing early childhood problems. And so it's also thinking of community members as an asset in that. And the third is that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And a lot of people have heard that, and that's what I want to spend a few more minutes on this morning. But the idea here is that if we build the coalition and the strategy and get organizations together who've typically competed, if we don't actually build a culture for them to work together effectively that's inclusive, a culture that builds trust, a culture that holds people accountable for the commitments they make to each other and to the group, it's not going to work. And to do that, we have to think differently about leadership within this context. As Lewis shared, I wrote a book a few years ago called Everyone Leads, and it doesn't mean everyone should be in charge at the same time. We know that's not something that works. What it means is that leadership is a muscle, and like every other muscle in our body, it gets stronger with exercise and practice, and that everyone has that muscle. And the goal of any organization, community, partnership is how do you build the collective leadership muscle of that group to create change? And so often what we see is the need to create multi-leader efforts where lots of people are leading together. And that's often how change happens. And to do that, we have to think differently. And the way we've come to define leadership in this work is to think of leadership as an action many can do, not just a position few can hold. And to shift the onus from the noun to the verb. And to think of what's the essence of leadership. You think about what the essence of leadership is. It's an act of responsibility. It's stepping up and owning a result. It's deciding, I'm going to make this happen. But then, again, if you think about it, what drives the leaders you admire, the ones you want to work with, the ones you want to be on teams with? It's the values that engage and connect people. Are we doing okay here, or we got a new one? We're switching over. Joan, I think we're going to be okay. This one actually has a little more movement. Yeah, great. So what I want to do is spend a moment to tell you a story of collective impact And it's a story that, to me, illustrates it and illustrates this idea of collective leadership in a better way than any other story I know. And it's a story you've heard, but you haven't heard it the way I'm going to tell it. And it's a story of Mrs. Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott. And we have to start with Mrs. Parks. She was a lifelong rebel and radical. And even growing up, she got in fights when she was mistreated. She'd always stood up for herself. In 1932, if you could switch, she married her husband Raymond, who was a barber, because of his activism. He had been involved in a case called the Scottsboro 9 case, and he was a community organizer in the effort, and she said it was his activism she fell in love with. In 1943, they went to their first NAACP meeting. The NAACP, up to that point, had been the Association of the Professional Class of African Americans, and they were working class people. But they found out that E.D. Nixon was running to be president of the local chapter. He was a porter on trains. And if elected, he'd be the first working class president of a chapter in the country. And they went to their first meeting, and sure enough, he was elected president. But no one ran to be secretary, and she was the only woman in the room that day, and that was considered women's work back then. And so at her first meeting, she gets elected secretary of the NAACP, a position she held for the next 12 years. And it's important to note that in this role, it was her job to document all of the cases of mistreatment, discrimination, and abuse in the community for over a decade. She was the documenter of the community stories. Through the NAACP, she went to trainings in Georgia and Florida by the master organizer, Ella Baker, who was the national field director of the NAACP and had been building leaders for an emerging movement. And she became a mentor of Rosa Parks and, among other things, encouraged her to create a youth council in Montgomery in which she worked with young people from Montgomery to step up to segregation in Montgomery. Then one day she was working for Clifford and Virginia Dewar. He was a local lawyer, and they were talking to her about her NAACP work when they encouraged her to go to the Highlander Folk School in Tennessee, which was running trainings on nonviolent civil disobedience for diverse groups of activists in the South. And when she expressed interest, Virginia Dewar raised the money among her friends to sponsor her to go to Highlander and actually took the bus with her to Knoxville, Tennessee to make sure she got there safely. At Highlander, she was trained by Septima Clark and Miles Horton, who'd also been training leaders. And they saw her as a real emerging leader in the movement, began mentoring her and supporting her and corresponding with her when she got back to Montgomery. She said that Highlander had a big impact on her life. It was the first time she had lived in an interracial community where everyone was treated equally. And she said it gave her a vision of the society she wanted to live in. Then a young lawyer moved to Montgomery, Fred Gray, who was 24 years old. He was the first African-American lawyer in Montgomery and the second in the state of Alabama. And Mrs. Parks took him under her wing and began taking him to lunch every week and sharing these cases she'd been documenting as secretary of the NAACP and looking at which ones they could turn into legal cases. Then in February of 1955, Claudette Colvin, who was a 15-year-old member of Rosa Parks Youth Council, refused to move to the back of the bus in Montgomery and was arrested. How many people know her name? Rosa Parks, Virginia Dewar, and others thought they should use her case to challenge the segregated bus system in Montgomery. But it was decided she wasn't sympathetic enough. They said she was too poor. They said she was too dark-skinned. They said she allegedly resisted arrest. She was a teen. And they chose not to take her case. 8 months later, in October of 1955, Mary Louise Smith, another member of Rosa Parks Youth Council, refused to move to the back of the bus and was arrested. Once again, the woman thought that she should be a candidate. The lawyers decided her father was a drunk, they were very poor, that she wouldn't be a good person to run a case against. 6 weeks later, on Thursday night, December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks refuses to move to the back of the bus and gets arrested. It was the second time she had been thrown off that bus by that bus driver for refusing to move. A lot of people don't know that. First time she wasn't arrested, but it was the second time that bus driver had removed her for refusing to move. It wasn't the first time she had done it. And she had done this after the students in her group had already done it and inspired her to do it. She went into jail, and then Clifford and Virginia Dewar and E.D. Nixon went to get her out. And they went back to their home and spent the next few hours with her talking about the idea of using her case as the one to take on segregation in Montgomery. And she and Raymond knew they'd lose everything if they did this, but they make the courageous choice to go forward. And then E.D. Nixon called Fred Gray, asking him to represent his friend Rosa in court that Monday. And then he called Joanna Robinson, if you could go back one. And Joanna was head of the Women's Political Council, which was an association of African-American women, professional women in Montgomery. She was a professor at Alabama State University. And they had been urging the male-dominated NAACP for 2 years to organize a bus boycott. And he says, we want to start a bus boycott on Monday. This is late Thursday night again. And he said, can you get the word out? And Joanna goes to her office at Alabama State University, now you can go next, and prints overnight 35,000 flyers. Now, if I asked any of you with the technology we have today to get me 35,000 copies of anything by tomorrow morning, you'd be like, it's impossible. This is 1955 technology. 35,000 flyers overnight, and all the women from the council met her first thing in the morning, and they fanned every bus stop in Montgomery with flyers announcing the boycott. Then, and this is absolutely true in how it happened, E.D. Nixon called Reverend Ralph Abernathy at First Street Baptist Church and asked him if he could convene a meeting of all the pastors in town. So on Sunday from the pulpit, they would all call for the boycott. And he said, I've got a better idea. There's this new pastor in town and no one knows him. Let's do the meeting at his church because if he gets run out of town, no one will notice. And that is literally how 26-year-old Martin Luther King was drafted in the movie. He was 26 years old. He had been in town 9 months. He was the new pastor at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. And that was the first time most of the pastors in town met him. They're all impressed by the young man, but they just saw him as the new young man in town. But they all agreed to call for the boycott. One white pastor attended that meeting, Robert Gratz, and his home was bombed as a result. That night, they had a mass meeting, or that Monday, no one took the bus, everyone walked. Everyone thought someone's going to get out. No one rode the bus. Everyone walked everywhere. And that night, they had a mass meeting at Holt Street Baptist Church. Over 5,000 people showed up. And the community voted unanimously that they wanted to continue the boycott. And so they created an organization that night to manage it, the Montgomery Improvement Association. If you go to the next, Rufus Lewis was a business owner. He had been the winning football coach at Alabama State University. He was college educated. And he had lost several elections to run the NAACP to E.D. Nixon, who was a porter on trains. And he didn't want Nixon to run this new effort, his rival. But he doesn't believe he can do it. So he hatches a plan behind the scenes, if you can go back one. And he goes before the community. And he says, we need someone completely neutral to lead us. If we're going to hold together, we have too many factions and too many differences. And as a deacon at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, with hopes of pulling strings behind the scenes, he nominates his young new pastor, Martin Luther King, to be that neutral leader, which is how King that night becomes head of the Montgomery Improvement Association. King calls his father in Atlanta, who's the most prominent pastor there at the time, who connected him to a pastor in Baton Rouge where there had been a bus boycott. This wasn't the first. And he said, people walk for maybe a week, and then you got to figure out how to get them everywhere. And so King appointed Lewis the transportation chair, and Lewis organized a 350-car carpool that transported the entire community of school, church, work, and shopping for 12 months. To raise money for this, two women, if you go to the next, Georgia Gilmore and Inez Ricks created competing clubs of women who made and sold food every week and competed to see who brought the most money to the mass meeting every Monday, which went to all the drivers for all the gas costs and all the tickets police kept giving them. Then Ella Baker took Rosa Parks on a tour of the North to raise money from NAACP donors. The Hordens and the Doers hit up the Highlander community. And then Baird Rustin came to town. E.D. Nixon was a member of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters Union, and its leader, A. Philip Randolph, was really dean of civil rights leadership in the first half of the 20th century. And his master, if you could go back one, his master organizer and strategist, Baird Rustin, was really the master strategist of the movement. He sends him down to Montgomery. And he meets with King, and he had followed Gandhi in India. And Rustin sits down with Nixon and King and talks about the idea of using this movement to practice a Gandhian nonviolent civil disobedience campaign. And King had read Gandhi in graduate school and gets quite excited. And Rustin said, 85 members of the Montgomery Improvement Association have now been indicted by the local police. Can you organize them, this is the next one, to put on their Sunday best, march down to the jail and turn themselves in, which it was the first mass civil disobedience of the movement. And then they were worried that this crazy guy from New York would be found, so he moved to Birmingham, where he coached and counseled King every day for the next year. And in fact, he and Ella Baker co-founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and Ella Baker became its first executive director to create a platform for a movement coming out of Montgomery. But Rosa Parks had been an officer in the NAACP for over a decade. Her husband had been a community organizer. They decided that she's also not a sympathetic enough character to win a national case. So yet another woman who refused to move to the back of the bus and been arrested, Aurelia Browder, it was her case that went up to the U.S. Supreme Court that overturned segregation in the South. And so my question to you at this point is, who is the leader of the Montgomery bus boycott? That's collective leadership. It doesn't in any way diminish the immense courage of Mrs. Parks or the incredible genius of Dr. King to recognize that their leadership story was part of a broader leadership story. But it's the idea that if we're going to move outcomes together, we have to build a table that has that kind of diversity of people who, again, contribute where they can. That we create spaces where lots of different people have assets and skills they can contribute to the initiative and help us move forward. And to build that kind of collective leadership, which is what it takes to move collective impact. It takes lots of people moving together. And when we look at any other big change in the past, we always find it's a network of leaders. Usually we hear about the one, because if you went to a Hollywood producer and said, I want to make a movie with 16 protagonists, they would tell you you're crazy. There's got to be one person, they have to have the hero's journey, it's the whole thing, right? But the reality is change is always more complex. It's always the leadership of the many, and that's what we have to be able to lead and practice to do this work right. And I'm just going to briefly touch on one last thing, just this will be the last slide, which is to do this, to build that culture, we have to think of what are the values that drive that kind of collective work. And the first is being asset-based. It's the recognition that to do this work, we have to think differently about community. We often, if we think of that proverbial glass, and is it half empty or half full, the correct answer is yes. It's both. And it's like every one of us, everyone we work with, everyone we serve or help. All of us have gifts and talents that are our fullness, the things we bring, the things that bring you to this room. But all of us, we're honest, we also have some emptiness. We have some things we don't do well. Mistakes we've made, regrets we hold, we have both. But community service is often about people who are defined by their fullness going into communities that are defined by their emptiness, to help people who've been labeled by their emptiness with the notion our job is to fill them with some of our fullness. And we think that's arrogant at best and maybe oppressive at worst. And that great leaders see that strength. That's when we start to think differently about who are leaders in our community. That the woman who checks in on the young mothers in the neighborhood is part of public health in our community. That the man who watches the kids on the playground after school is part of youth development. And when we start to think that residents, people in community are assets and partners in solving problems and not just products that or of the services we provide. But recognizing that to get to the outcomes we need, we have to think of community as a partner, not just community agencies, but community members as partners in getting to those outcomes. The second is inclusion and equity, and recognizing that in almost every issue we work on, there are racial disparities in outcomes, and if we're going to address those, we have to address those disparities. And to do that, we have to understand where they are, and then we have to target our work differentially to different populations to move everyone to the outcome that we're seeking. And to recognize we need to do that. We also, to do that, we have to have diversity at our tables because we don't know everything about the communities we're in. We don't know how things work in community or who are the closest relationships. If a group of social workers had decided how to reach farmers in Southwest Wisconsin, but they had farmers at the table. So inclusion is recognizing that who are you listening to and engaging and listening to as you're building strategies to make sure you're meeting people where they are and bringing solutions to people where they are. To do collaboration, well, it's all works at the speed of trust. And how are you actively building trust within the groups? How do you create a space where the conversations that usually happen in the parking lot after the meeting happen in the meeting? That's when you know you've got trust. Is that you've built a space where if we know that there are multiple organizations at the table, not all of them are going to get funded, we have that conversation in the room. Because we've built enough relationship and trust about people, among people that we can. And we move the kind of sniping and things that happen outside, we move it to things we can talk about openly inside. That we create a space of continuous learning. That if we're going to do this work together, we've got to be open to the fact that as good as our programs are, they're not good enough. And we're going to have to be willing to look at data, make hard choices, sometimes stop things we're doing, sometimes start other things. And be in an environment where we're open to inquiry about our work and each other's work so that we can move towards those outcomes. And finally, is integrity. If you think about it, if leadership in essence is an act of responsibility, The price of that is accountability, right? There's no leadership without accountability. It doesn't exist. And that accountability exists at the level of our own purpose and values, the commitments we make to each other, but ultimately to the impact we're trying to have for people in the community that we serve. And that integrity is how we hold those accountabilities together. Because our integrity as a leader is based on how we demonstrate that accountability for the responsibility we take as a leader when we commit to make things happen. And especially when it comes to community outcomes. And so for us, these are the things that kind of drive that kind of culture building that's essential for collective impact. So if we think of collective impact as a way to organize a community to move population change, and we can have a clear strategy at the level of sophistication and scale needed to achieve it, if we can build the form of that collective around what we're trying to do to make sure we have the right partners and right people engaged in order to get there, and if we can build a culture of inclusion, of collaboration, of community engagement, etc., that's what, and accountability most importantly, that's what it takes to move these kind of outcomes. So I want to thank you all for being in this three-dimensional lunch with bad tech that we fixed during the time. Some great adaptive work there. And I'm going to hand it back to my hosts to close us out, and thank you.